Hello, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 2 of the ESG Experience, the podcast about all things ESG and beyond. Whether you're an ESG expert or just dipping your toes into the ESG universe, this podcast is for you. Together, we'll navigate the alphabet soup of ESG, share strategies, and discuss industry news and trends. I'm Helee Lev, SVP of Operations at Conservice.
And I'm Ryan Nelson, SVP and General Manager of ESG at Conservice.
Today, we are joined by Nancy Mentesana,
the ESG Executive Director of Labrador US, a leading global communications firm focused exclusively on corporate disclosure documents for more than 300 clients worldwide. Nancy is an accomplished communications professional with over 15 years of experience defining editorial strategies and designing clear and persuasive materials for internal and external corporate audiences. In her current role, Nancy guides companies seeking to present their sustainability strategy and progress to stakeholders. Nancy leverages her governance background to advise companies on the best approach to communicating with investor stakeholders while considering the guidelines of ESG frameworks. In this episode, we're going to get into it. We're going to get real in it. We're unraveling the evolving world of ESG disclosures, spotlighting the recent SEC mandates. We're going to explore how these regulations reshape the perception of ESG reporting amongst companies, transitioning it from voluntary to mandatory. Some of us have been waiting our whole career for that to happen. This is the golden age of not having to convince people why ESG matters. The legislation is going to do so. And we're going to delve into the evolution of some of the reporting frameworks from traditional to emerging standards like TCFD and SASB. We may demystify the S of social and the G in governance, perhaps less known about or less talked about factors in real estate, while providing actionable guidelines for private companies navigating ESG reporting requirements. So that's a lot. We have a big agenda to get through here, friends. Let's do it. Let's get
Yeah, we do. Welcome, Nancy. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
And I agree, it is a big agenda in a great way. I think it's going to be very educational, but also very conceptual to kind of understand where we're at in this world. Question for anybody, but I think for you, Nancy, did you hear that the SEC made new rules about disclosures, climate related? Did you hear about that?
Yeah, I might have heard a thing or two about that.
Well,
I gotta tell you, it was the first time in my career I've actually logged in to listen to an SEC commissioner presentation on a ruling. So it was hot listening for our team.
Okay, great. Yeah, I want to hear about that. So not all of our listeners will necessarily know, but just tell me if I got this part right. The SEC has said that for public companies, or some of them anyway, climate disclosures are now part of the annual requirement, or will be, or something like that. That's the rough highest level part, right?
Correct.
Okay, so tell us about this meeting. Like, that's very interesting. Did someone announce this? Was there like boos or cheers, or is it more just what was it, dry? What was that like?
Yeah, it was interesting because the commissioners are coming at it from very different angles. I'm sure many are aware it was pretty split. Currently, the rule was almost instantly challenged. It went into an immediate stay, meaning it was put on pause. Then we pressed the go button again. Now we're back on pause. And so it's a bit of kind of a herky-jerky adoption here. But the commissioners were essentially on two sides of the same coin. One set arguing that this was overreach and unnecessary. And the other side saying that, no, this is risk critical information that investors need in order to effectively make a sound investment decision. So it was squarely within the remit of the SEC. So that it was very cut and dry. Not a whole lot of excitement. There was no toasting or anything of that regards, but there was certainly some passionate conversation and presentation about the position that the each respective commissioner took.
So the SEC is somewhat the authority that makes these requirements regarding companies that are publicly listed, right?
Correct.
Okay, and there's, I think, am I correct that there's 5 people and it was like a 3-2 sort of thing? Does that sound,
exactly.
Okay, so literally these 5 people make this rule and they did it. And then that's interesting. I knew it was paused and then back on again and then paused again. Okay, so what do you know? What is a little more detail about it, or what is the perception of the new rules among companies right now? Should private companies be, is there action? Is it all public companies? I heard it's a subset of public companies, not till 2026. Are these myths, or what's the truth of this?
Yeah, so it's right now it does apply to private companies because it is currently a stay. This means that it could impact the adoption period, and it does predominantly impact larger companies. The interesting thing about this is that if you look at the S&P 500, 100% of them are reporting some form of sustainability related information for public consumption. So it doesn't necessarily impact the fact that companies are already sharing information with their critical stakeholders. What it does do is it puts information that they may or may not be disclosing into the financial reporting. And financial reporting means it is subject to an audit, which means it goes through a more rigorous systems and controls. And it also means that it's under the remit of a board committee. So the audit committee does, in theory, have oversight. If they didn't already have oversight based upon the governance structure of the organization, they now absolutely have it, because it will need to go into the financial reporting at some point. So it's interesting. You also might have heard a lot of debate of groups saying, well, this is totally watered down on one hand, and you have other groups saying, we don't want to be reporting this information. It could disclose maybe proprietary information about the business, or you name it. The list goes on of reasons of why groups wouldn't want to do it. But the reality is, if you take a step back and look at what the SEC has done, this is squarely a regulatory matter. This is a securities matter. It is information that investors are already asking for in some way, shape, or form in order to make their business decisions. The SEC is attempting to create a framework around that standardizes it, that makes it consistent from company to company, so that it is reliable information that investors can depend on. Because currently there are no requirements to audit this information within the United States. It doesn't have to go through assurance, and groups don't necessarily have to follow a particular framework because it has been traditionally voluntary. This is the first step that the United States has made towards making this information more regulated. So it is interesting to sit back and see how groups are responding to it, but for the most part, it hasn't been nearly as fireworks as I think a lot of folks were anticipating.
Yeah.
And
So go ahead.
No, go.
You go.
Okay, I'll go. I was just going to say, so I mentioned, in my introduction, that us sustainability professionals, or people who have been in the space for the better part of 20 years, like myself, like Brian, not sure about you, Nancy, we were kind of waiting for this day, right, when the regulation would come and it would become mandatory. So it would stop being a question of like if and when, and I don't have budget and we're not into it or we're not doing it. Just as a professional, Nancy, what's your opinion? What do you think is like the appropriate balance of mandatory and voluntary? Do you think they both have a place? Do you think that, now that things are moving more towards mandatory and reporting requirements like this, do you think that's a good thing? Like, how do you, what's your opinion?
Yeah, so one of the primary pillar at Labrador has always been transparency. We see transparency of information as being critical for the effective relationship and trust between an organization and its stakeholders, whoever that group may be: employees, investors, NGOs, government entities. And this type of regulated information, applying a structure around climate-related rules, gives companies and gives their stakeholders a consistent framework that they can follow. Without it, it's a bit of the wild, wild west. One of the past several years, without any type of guidance from the SEC, it has left mainly the large institutional investors in the position to create the standards of what companies were reporting on. If Larry Fink from BlackRock said, I would like to see this type of information, sure enough, 12 months later, that information would typically be in a company's reporting because their largest investor wanted that information. So in this particular circumstance, what it does is it takes the the void that the large institutions have been filling and puts it back into the regulated landscape, which arguably is where it should sit. There's those that would argue otherwise, but what it does is it does create that consistency for comparability across the board. I do think it's really important to note that because this information would be going in financial statements, it's the audit that matters. This is going through third-party review. It's being verified. There's very rigorous controls around it. It would be the same level of controls that current financial reporting information go through. So it does take the general reporting governance structure up significantly, even if companies were already following best practices for their voluntary disclosures.
Helee, were you asking my opinion too, or just Nancy's?
Yeah, your opinion matters very, very much.
Okay. Well, as a layperson, I've been looking into this recently, and I think I'm starting to understand it. So these are disclosure requirements. So anytime you throw the word climate in there, there's going to be discussion and debate, and it's a polarizing topic for some weird reason. So these are disclosure requirements. So you don't have to do anything. Right? You don't have to say, I'm going to save the planet, or I'm going to be nice to my employees. You just have to disclose what's happening. And well, why? Because public markets are a powerful and awesome thing in a way, right? The non-accredited person can't play in private markets. They can't create wealth by investing and doing certain things like in private equity. It's difficult. So we've got public markets where we can do that. Well, if I'm going to do that either with help from an advisor or personally, I want to be able to read and figure it out and know what's going on and have confidence in the accuracy of reports that I'm reading about these companies, because then I'm going to give them money. I'm going to give them stuff that maybe I'm planning to retire with. So it's climate related because that's important. The other way to think about it maybe is non-financial reporting, right? There's financial reporting, and everything in the world has been about properly reporting your financials so I can look at them. But it's totally reasonable and fair as a consumer that I want to know other stuff, not just your financials, to make my decisions of if I think. And one of those relevant things right now is if you're not thinking about climate, if you don't have a committee, if you're not disclosing what you're doing, then I might not want to invest in you because you might be putting yourself out of business or creating risk that I'm not comfortable with. So it seems pretty logical to me that you have to report stuff beyond just your financials, and that regulation is coming around that. And I guess part of my point was we're leaving you open to be as irresponsible as you want to be still, as long as you tell us about it, right? Disclosure gets you off the hook. Like, I told you, right? So if I invest and then they go ruin something, and they're like, but I told you I wasn't doing anything about it right here in my disclosure. So I'm like, oh yeah, that's on me then.
Yeah.
Is that right?
You're spot on. This is not the SEC taking a stance on climate. Right. This is just asking for information so that companies essentially aren't blindsided. And to think that there aren't climate related elements out there that would affect an investor's decision is frankly a little it's old school. It's a bit naive because we just had a large distribution facility wrecked by a tornado in Western Michigan, last night or yesterday. I mean, these things are happening, and they're happening often, and they're happening at a higher frequency as time goes on. So companies and investors are going to want to know what their full portfolio risk looks like. And this is just making sure that there's transparency of the risk, for better or for worse. You're right. You can be more, if you're doing evil things, at least you're being transparent about doing evil things.
I think though, people are smart. It starts that way. And I'll be very clear, where my alignment is. I'm all for it. I believe in global warming, climate change, but I think people know kind of what's coming after that. Like when we in commercial real estate started with the municipal benchmarking. So each municipality, state or city said that you had to disclose your energy. It was kind of the same thing. Like your building could be a pig. All you have to do is disclose it to the city and you avoid getting a nominal fine. In the worst case, you might get a $500 fine for not disclosing. No one's going to say anything. Now that we're in, the next evolution of that, and there is starting to be teeth and there are starting to be hefty penalties for buildings that aren't performing. So it kind of starts out like that, and maybe this will be the same thing where it starts out as just a transparency thing, just disclosure. No one's telling you what to do or not to do. But I think people know and see the writing on the wall that it might evolve into there being some sort of rule if it's going to follow something like that, where, now that there are laws about reduction and things like that.
Yeah, I would argue in this particular circumstance, the SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're about keeping investors informed of the information that they need. So it may be that some type of penalties come in the future state, but it's not because of the SEC. It might be because of the EPA. The SEC just requires that information. What it may do, though, and it's very likely to do, is that it may close companies off from their access to different capital sources, right? It may close off their access to green revenue or green bonds or whatever it may be. So there's going to be a relative indirect but nearly direct financial repercussion of it. But as far as performance related fees or penalties or something like that, that would not necessarily fall underneath the SEC.
Yeah, it wouldn't come from the SEC. That makes sense.
Right. Now, that makes sense. A particular public markets exchange could do something, I guess, right? And not to go back, this is another topic, but like NASDAQ did like a DEI rule that they made. So I guess there's some other authority that could do something like that. But I doubt the New York Stock Exchange has that in them to do something like that personally. But yeah.
No, the New York Stock Exchange is being vocal against what NASDAQ was doing. Like they were being or kind of saying you should be the best board members for the job. You shouldn't have like quotas or affirmative action. So we talked about it on our last podcast. We meant to follow up and see if NASDAQ, where it's going, because they announced it like a couple of years ago already. Do you know, Nancy?
I should know more about that.
Are they doing it? I know no one actually knows.
I don't. But how about this? I do.
Before the next podcast, I promise to the tens of thousands of listeners that we will research it and we will have answers.
One thing, just before we leave that point, I do think it is important to just make sure that groups understand it is, the SEC is setting the frameworks, they're setting the guidelines, right? The information that we need to swim in. They're not necessarily taking an opinion or a stance, but there are other groups out there like NASDAQ or, NYSE, or even, the New York Comptroller's Office had a pretty big influence on public disclosures just a few years ago. What it does is there's a difference between the requirement and what groups want to see. And that's where it comes into voluntary reporting. Right. And that's where it can get a little bit tricky. And so one of the sensitivities, and this is, again, coming back to maybe the governance and the structure of it, organizations the rule does fundamentally change the way in which organizations need to consider what information goes where. Something that we're working on a lot right now is we refer to as the Unified Disclosures Project, and looking at what information is communicated in which document and why. So some information goes in the 10K, some information will go in the proxy statement, some information will go into the ESG report or the non-financial disclosures. And that's important. And the final kind of exclamation point on this is, right now, even though there's no penalty, for example, if you go out there and you communicate your scope 3 emissions and they're massive, that's not going to get you in the hot seat per se, with at least the SEC. It might with your investors.
Sure.
But what would get you in the hot seat is if you are communicating as something being a risk in your ESG report, your sustainability disclosures, but you're not communicating that as a risk in your 10K. Right, that's where there's consistency, and that's where groups need to lean in and have more scrutiny and more rigor of making sure that they're communicating consistently across the board. And there's been plenty of comment letters that the SEC has sent out to companies recently saying, well, you say this in this report over here, but you ignore it or say something differently in this reporting over here. What is it? And that's something that no governance family wants to receive within any company, is a letter from the SEC asking for clarification on are you saying this or are you saying that? Please clarify.
I see. So yeah, I mean, I tend to be for less regulation, but regulation is required. But is this important? Yes, it is. It seems very important. We got to do it. It creates an extra burden for them, but it's important enough to make that burden to apply that burden. I mean, I think, yeah, that's how I'm seeing it. Yeah, like, sorry, you got to do it. You can't have conflicting reports. You got to get it together. You got to figure out a framework, and we deserve this information.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's just going back to that earlier point. It's worth noting that the majority of companies are already gathering and measuring this type of information, and maybe making it public in a way that the company has had, previous discomfort with, but a lot of groups are already doing it. It sort of just moves the information around, and it puts a higher level of rigor and scrutiny on it.
Is this the kind of thing too that will be around? Meaning, so you mentioned, Nancy, that there were already stays and it was being challenged, and it kind of, Ryan mentioned it passed by a narrow margin of 3-2. Is it the kind of thing that once it gets up and going, it goes, or can they re-vote on it next year and strike it down, and then someone brings it back, and then could it be that whole thing, or once it's passed and it's through these stays, it's kind of going to be, the new norm?
So it's worth noting, I'm not a securities attorney, so I'm just a full disclosure there. And I feel like what we previously knew to be norms isn't necessarily what we should know or consider to be the norm moving forward. And the reality is that sort of circumstance of whether a new administration comes in and says, we're permanently putting this on hold, I don't know if that is something that we can rely on or not. It's kind of in a new trotted territory, given the extreme political circumstances that this topic is under right now.
Makes sense. All right. Do you want to shift gears to frameworks, Ryan, or did I just already shift gears to frameworks by saying it?
Well, I'm usually the odd numbers and you're usually the even numbers, so that's
I agree. You are
odd. All right. So, okay. So public companies, they now have to do, they were already doing it. There's a little more rigor. What about, what goes beyond that? Frameworks. I mean, I'm trying to connect the dots here, which is not too hard, but really a whole nother topic that you have a lot of expertise on that's interesting to our user base are the frameworks and some of the, I'll call it shake up. I don't know, maybe that's a little aggressive, but how the ISSIB fits into all this. And let's just kind of educate ourselves on where we're at today.
Yeah, this is a fun topic, and takes so much concentration and focus that it's an overwhelming topic, even for a group like ours that lives and breathes and sleeps and drinks this every single day. We're students of the frameworks. It changes almost every day, in some way, shape, or form. And throwing in the added layer of regulatory, not only with the SEC, but also with the California rules, in particular, those that are impacted by CSRD over in Europe. I mean, this is a hard one to herd right now. It's almost like grabbing your arms around a cloud. It is constantly moving. So I will try my best to go high level without putting folks to sleep on this particular topic, because just a couple years ago, it was real straightforward. It was GRI, SASB, and TCFD. And for many of the listeners here, it could have also applied to GRESB or GRESB, depending on how you throw that B in there at the end. But ultimately, what we're looking at now is the Value Reporting Fund came in and merged SASB, what we knew as SASB, with I believe it was the Integrated Reporting Coalition, the IIRC. Value Reporting Fund is now no longer, and that goes underneath ISSB. So in a way, you can look at ISSB as being one of the primary new authority. Underneath ISSB are two requirements. One is a general disclosures topic, more aligned to the way that GRI has previously had general disclosures. And this is information that is broadly about the organization and more specific, maybe climate related information to the company. So we're now asking all companies the same questions within their general disclosures. Under the other element, it is TCFD as we knew it. So TCFD, if you go to tcfd.org right now, you get a box that says, we no longer exist. TCFD is now under ISSB.
Okay.
And the added element is the SASB industry disclosures. So that was previously what people knew as SASB, was their industry specific topics. They would go into the SASB materiality website, type in their company name, and it would say, you should report on this particular SASB industry standard. And companies would do that. Sometimes one would apply, sometimes multiple would apply, depending on the business. That is now just one part of the ISSB disclosure. So you have the general disclosures, you have the TCFD disclosures, and then you have the industry-specific disclosures, and that's what makes up ISSB. ISSB is still because of the SASB influence, it's still the voluntary reporting that most probably investors are looking for in the United States, outside of what could potentially be within the SEC and California, as an example.
Okay, so
Pause right there because it goes on. I can go on to the other.
Right.
So that one out.
High level. So ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board.
Correct.
In the research that I did, it looks like it came from a UN climate change conference. Okay, cool. And it is part of the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS.
Yes.
Okay, so that organization, I would imagine, kind of knows how to do this thing and consolidate standards and make them effective. And so now they're doing that with sustainability standards. Seems logical to me, and the consolidation maybe helps standardize and provides more direction. Is that a reasonable takeaway, or is this just constant shifting that we just have to keep dealing with?
No, there's definitely logic to it. And it's similar to the themes we were just discussing about creating more rigors and control and moving this closer to moving non-financial related information reporting closer to the rigors and controls of financial reporting. And IFRS is not a new entity. The way that I personally think about it, and I know some financial reporting professionals might have a problem with this, is I think of IFRS in the same way I think of GAAP, right? It's a reporting methodology, and the fact that this established financial reporting overseer is now overseeing what was previously SASB. So this is, our ISSB, means that we are considering this non-financial related information in the same level of significance as we're thinking of a financial related information.
Did they create GAAP or no?
I don't believe so, but then again, not a financial reporting professional.
Yeah. Okay.
So all this is in the spirit of consolidation, making it easier, but I will say it's good for professionals like you and like me, because I think customers still just need help navigating. I mean, we always call it, I think I said in the intro, the alphabet soup of ESG, and it's ever evolving. So once people maybe got down, TCFD and SASB, but now they're this new thing under this thing. So it's good. Keeps us in business, I suppose. But it is a lot to handle. It is a lot for customers, especially. It's intimidating,
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. We refer to it as whiplash, because it's just really, and it's hard to keep the alphabet soup straight. One of the things that we were happy to see is that ISSB and GRI are cooperating. So in theory, what it's doing is it's giving reporters the ability to have a bit more focus and to not be worried about, well, did these disclosures check the box? Okay, move on to these ones, right? There's more conversation around interoperability and the usefulness from framework to framework to framework. I got to do a shout out here for TNFD, which oftentimes doesn't get discussed. And TNFD is essentially TCFD, but for nature-related and biodiversity-related disclosures. So this is something where if an organization has a large footprint from a real estate perspective, or they have facilities that are near a potentially challenged water source or a biodiverse wetlands area, TNFD is something that might very well impact them because they have a potential impact on the environment. So that's something just to keep in mind. Throw that one out there. Again, it's nature-related financial disclosures that are it's aligned with the way that TCFD reporting takes place currently.
All right. I don't remember that we agreed you were allowed to add more to the soup today, Nancy, but okay.
Sorry.
All right, well, let's go back to a bit simpler concept. we'll go back to one letter acronyms. So in ESG, we talk a lot about the E, especially our firm is real estate focused, commercial real estate focused, are very heavy on the E, the built environment. Let's talk about S and G.
Yeah.
So maybe for folks on this podcast that are not experts, Nancy, if you don't mind unpacking that at a elementary level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Specifically with real estate, what do we mean when we say S and G?
Yeah. So the reality is S is every organization out there, big or small, has an S consideration because we all have employees and we all have a talent pool and prospective employees and groups that we want to keep close. So the it's worth taking on just let's kind of unpack S from and then we'll go on to G. But it's interesting to look at it because there are disclosures that apply agnostic of industry, right? So nearly every company needs to think about human capital management disclosures. And this applies to talent recruitment and retention, pay equity, benefits, training and development, employee safety, and frankly, overall culture. Culture is something that from our exposure to engagements right now with various stakeholders, culture is a really important topic to many outside groups. And so think about the conversation of topic to your employee stakeholders. Now think about it in the context of your talent acquisition, getting new employees to come to you. Okay, now think about it in regards to your community engagement, your investor engagement, your board engagement. Being able to maintain, attract talent is one of the drivers of a successful business, especially for groups that are within growth stage. You need to be able to keep on the cutting edge, and having access to the talent pool is one of the best ways to do it. Now, another element that's maybe less, fuzzy than some of the elements I just mentioned, like culture, would be cybersecurity and data privacy risks. That is a very real capital R risk that every single organization faces. And this falls underneath the social disclosures. For a company to not be, guarantee you that groups are considering probably very heavily their cyber exposures and their privacy of information. How they disclose on it is a whole nother topic, and something that is a critical capital R risk that groups are going to be looking for. And that is across the board. This is something that is going to be of probably utmost importance to all stakeholder groups, not just one maybe noisy audience. It's relevant to all of them.
Sure.
Going on to the G. Now, the G we like to think of as ultimately the foundation of these programs. So the governance and oversight of ESG topics, ultimately, it shows the commitment to these topics, but it also gets these topics closer to being synonymous with the overall business strategy. And that's something that is of kind of forward-thinking conversations at the moment. So, related topics include board oversight of anything underneath the ESG umbrella, company-wide risk management, ethics and compliance. And ethics and compliance, this includes anti-corruption, tax compliance, code of conducts for both employees and suppliers. I mean, it's a very diverse collection of topics that are very critical to the overall success of how a company operates day in and day out. So even though it's not, it's very different from maybe a topic like your scope 1 emissions, it is still very critical from an organizational health perspective to have these elements and to have these structures in place, and then to share that organizational health and structure to your stakeholders so that they have the confidence in the business. That's, I mean, where I've distilled a heck of a lot of information there into some pretty surface level information, but I think that it's important to think about S as your people capital and your G as to how you reinforce and make sure that these elements are actually properly governed and properly overseen and keep all of us in good working order.
Yeah, I mean, to me, to roll it all up again, ESG plus your financial statements that we all know and or have some familiarity with, whatever, covers everything I need to know about a business. Like that's it makes sense to me. Like all the non-financial stuff, I want to know about how you treat your people, your impact on the environment that doesn't, there's no economy without an environment. And what rules do you have in place to make sure that those things are upheld? What's that foundation, like you said? And then show me your financial statements. I feel like it's just such a great way to say that's the full picture of a company. Financial statements are a portion of the story of a company. Financial statements plus some reasonable ESG reporting give me the whole picture. So I don't know. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
Let's spend just a minute on our third topic here. We said we had an agenda. I do want to get through all four of them, but let's just spend 1 minute on the third one. So we talked all about the you could almost call them signals, because I mean it's an SEC requirement, so it's more than a signal.
Yeah.
But it's still for only like certain company, accelerated company, like the big ones, and then it'll go to other ones.
Filers, yeah.
What are they called again?
Large accelerated filers.
Large accelerated filers. So big ones. And then, and then it'll come down. Does it signal anything to private companies? Does anything change, or how is this perceived by private companies?
Yeah, so great question. I would actually, it can go one of two ways for private companies. On one hand, looking at your investor pool, if you do have external investors, they're going to be pretty vocal, typically speaking, about the information that they are interested in gathering from their portcos. So if you do have a large institutional investor in your oversight, in your board, like let's say like a BlackRock or a State Street or a Vanguard, whatever they may be, their requirements of you are not going to differ all that much, if any at all, from what the public companies report on. They're going to be looking for specific frameworks, specific disclosures. So that's actually a bit more transparent. Where it becomes a little bit more nuanced is if you have maybe an impact fund within your investment portfolio there. Their requirements are going to be different. They are going to be navigated typically by the Global Impact Investing Network, also known as GIN, and there's different frameworks that they follow. Impact investing does take into more of account that financial reporting and how their direct impacts on ESG and vice versa. It goes both directions. So depending on if a company is public or private could very well impact how they report. In bottom line, what we are seeing is whether you're doing this because one of your investors has asked for it, is going to take you on one journey, but very likely this information, if it's not currently requested or required by employees, it will be in a short period of time. There is a surge within the sort of next generation of talent that is demanding this type of disclosure, in particular the e-disclosure, to their employees, so that they understand, is this the company that I want to apply my talents to? Is this a company that I can get behind? And this has been sort of a rumble for a while, but absolutely with the kind of the newest generation entering the workforce, it is a demand. There's influencers on social media. I'm not that old, but it's something I would have never considered social media to influence how I look at a company. Now it is a large influence of how companies are being seen, and different influencers out there making movements around, where do you want to who do you want to get into bed with? Who is a group that you ultimately could see yourself supporting and making better? Do they align with your ethos? Do they align with your either your integrity or with your values from an environment perspective, a social perspective? You can see this with the unrest that's going on college campuses right now. There's students that are making demands of companies of university positions, and they feel so passionate about it and bolded with it that they're going to impact their own ability to get a degree, and frankly, others people's to get a degree. So it's definitely something that we have to not pay attention to it, as we have to consider moving younger people into the workforce is pretty short-sighted.
Yeah, I love the concept that ultimately we answer to each other, individuals, consumers, employees. We can say, well, we got to do what the investors say, but ultimately, if us as individuals demand something from the companies we work for, or the places that we're going to put our money, or where we want pension funds putting our money, like, ultimately it comes down to us as individuals to, have a responsible, sustainable economy within our environment. So that's great.
Yeah.
Helee, what do you think about this? This is the last time, arguably, that we're going to cover this topic, the ESG backlash. I feel like we need to ask Nancy about it. I know, but Nancy's going to put it to bed for us. Nancy,
we're never talking about it again.
On top of what I learned in a great sustainability summit a couple of weeks ago, that we think, and you can challenge this, Nancy, the consensus subjectively was that the backlash is at its peak, and I'll just leave it there. That backlash is at its peak as opposed to like continuing to grow and be a nuisance. How do you feel about that? What is the impact? Are investors reacting? Green hushing is a thing now, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on this backlash?
Yeah. Okay. So I do think that I would like to think that we are just on the backside of the bell curve for the backlash. I think a lot of it is news cycle and politically motivated. I'll put that out there.
Sure.
Green hushing it's a thing. It's a thing to say it's not is silly. But ultimately, it's important to remember that and specifically, I'm going to BlackRock, right? I'm thinking about, Larry Fink. He prepares his letters to CEOs every year. It gets a lot of attention. It's sort of like, it's a day. It probably gets as much readership as what the SEC climate rules got, but on an annual basis. And it made headlines this year that he doesn't refer to ESG anywhere within his letter. And it's worth noting that even though the acronym per se isn't there, it's still the entity, BlackRock, the entity is still investing in ways that align towards moving us to a no carbon economy. Like that. So it's one of the things, saying the words and changing your actions are two very different things. So, I personally take the stance that ESG is a bit of a lightning rod. And so people just aren't using those three letters in that particular order and avoiding the lightning rod in many circumstances. They are still using terms like stakeholder capitalism, sustainable investing, or climate investing. So you're still seeing it out there, and you're still seeing the programs, you're still seeing action there. And a good example of this is at the last UN Climate Summit, a new investment fund was created. And BlackRock is getting $2 billion of that to invest in existing ESG funds. The goal there is to grow that new climate fund, which they're referring to as Altera, to $250 billion by 2030. So clearly, the investment is still moving in that particular direction. A piece recently in Forbes, it was published at the end of March, I believe. It reminded readers that despite backlash in 2023, BlackRock had 16% increase in managed assets last year. And so this kind of it underscores that, the language itself can change, but it doesn't mean that the entire investment strategy is going to change course as well.
And that's what I'm consistently gathering is everyone's like, we're still doing the same things. Sometimes we're changing the word. Sometimes we need to hush about it and not talk so publicly about it, which I think is a terribly sad point of view for all of us. I'm a little bit disappointed. I don't know if I have the authority to say this, but in Larry Fink for, not just plowing through and keeping the terminology the way it is, but okay, fine. I'll leave that there. But yeah, we continue to hear that people are continuing to do things that they're doing because it's real financial risk. It's a real driver in an organization's success. So I don't know.
It's investor demanded. Your investors want
investor demanded.
Yeah. On the Larry Fink thing, if you look at BlackRock's website, they still have like a sustainability report. They're doing all the same things. They haven't changed a thing. They're just calling it something different. So to me, like the joke's on the people that are like, now it's fine because the words ESG are not being used. This is good. This is good. Like that's smart. Good for him. They're doing all the same things. They're just they're changing the name of it.
Yeah, and it shows a lack of understanding. I mean, let's be real.
People have just attached onto one word. They don't understand that sustainability and ESG, for all intents and purposes, are interchangeable. Like, joke's on them.
Yeah, Yeah,
Very
and not
good.
only do they have
Take their money and invested in good sustainability causes.
exactly,
Yeah.
and not only are they keeping the holding the torch and continuing to move in that same direction relatively unaltered, they're it's worth taking a look at their sustainability report because it's quite good.
It's great.
It's a very good report. So it's definitely one worth noting. Something that caught our attention pretty significantly was actually the DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion. That felt substantially more impact, I think, because that did change meaningfully in light of the Supreme Court's decision last year on affirmative actions with higher education. That had a ripple effect into corporations that was pretty
Sure.
chilling and pretty quick. So that is an area where we continue to keep a finger on it, because that does expose a company based upon how they've set goals or how they are communicating around that can be challenging. It's certainly something to navigate. But I will say the final point here is what we're seeing is that in light of the backlash, there is a silver lining. And what that silver lining is it is forcing companies to do a better job transparently disclosing why they have certain goals and why those strategies make financial sense, right? So it's coming back to the board and thinking about how can we be more thoughtful about this, and why do these particular topics influence our strategy, and why should they influence our strategy, and to think about it in a way that is maybe less impassioned. And one of the ways that we're kind of referring to it here at Labrador is, it's taking the short term embedded with a long-term transition. That's the way that we're thinking about it.
Yeah, I like it. And with that, case closed on the backlash for the ESG Experience podcast, right, Helee? We don't need to talk about it anymore. That's the final word on that.
Good.
One last thing, Nancy, before we wrap here, we a lot of listeners stay all the way to the end here for this silly game that I made up. So it's just one question we're going to ask you, and this is somewhat interesting to me from your point of view in communications. This game is called Things Previously Named Other Things. Okay. That's all. I'm going to ask you a question. What is the name? I'm going to give you 4 options. What is the name of the company that was once named Bourbon? BURBN. What is the name of the company that was once named Bourbon? What is their name now? Is it A, Snap, B, Pinterest, C, Twitter, or D, Instagram?
Oh my God. I have no idea.
No?
Let's just go with like, if you said C was Twitter. Usually C is tried and true, but I don't know about that. Let's go with Instagram.
That's right.
Woohoo!
Congratulations.
Nice.
But I'm glad that we don't really know and we're guessing, because that means people aren't dead naming them. They're going with their name Instagram. So good. Yeah, they named it after one of the favorite drinks of someone there, and then eventually communicated that it was about instant photography and messaging, telegrams, and made Instagram. But maybe they must have done a good job on the communications of their name change.
Well, Ryan,
I forget where I saw this. It might have been 1871, which is like one of the incubators in Chicago, but they had these posters where they were like infographics of the evolution of some of these companies. And I specifically remember the Instagram one being a really strange journey. It was like, invented as this, and the intent was to do this, but then they pivoted to this, but that didn't work. So then they did this, and then they renamed it to this, but it wasn't this. And it's these like, I'll see if I can find and send it, but they're these cool infographics that show like how the journey went, and then like how it eventually got to be whatever unicorn it was. So.
Well, thank you for playing, and well done.
Yeah, good job winning. Not many people win. Actually, it's quite hard. Ryan asks tough questions, so only our smartest guests win.
I'll weigh it as a badge of honor. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Nancy, for joining us. This has been another wonderful episode of the ESG Experience podcast. We appreciate our listeners. If you enjoyed your time with us, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast directory. There's a new episode every month, and we do appreciate the continued support of our podcast. If you want to continue the conversation between episodes, follow us on your favorite social media channel at #ESG Experience. And we will catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nancy. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.